and an American rifle team creeps cautiously along an ancient street. Backs to imposing Gothic architecture. Behind the team, an M4 Sherman slowly crawls into the open, and the street behind the tank erupts in flame. One GI snaps toward the source of the misdirected rocket, and instead of a fanatic SS grenadier, his eyes meet the terrified gaze of a trembling old man. A motley crew of elders and boys fire down at the Americans with a hodgepodge of antique firearms. The GI's view is obscured by smoke and debris as the Sherman's main gun fires into the ground floor of the closest building, bringing it crashing down with a roar of falling masonry. The GIs come to a grim realization. Even in their chaotic desperation, the Germans intend to make them pay for every inch of Aachen in blood. As chill autumn winds began blowing across the battlefields of Europe, over 230,000 Allied soldiers crept toward the ancient city of Aachen. Strategically, Aachen was of minimal significance, a stop along one of the four main roads leading to Germany's industrial heartland. Hardly a natural fortress, the city sat in a depression surrounded by hills, and most of its defenses were provided by two parallel belts of the West Wall. Yet in addition to being the very first ethnically German city besieged by the Allies, Aachen had once been the capital city of Adolf Hitler's beloved First Reich, known by more rational historians as the Holy Roman Empire. Naturally, any threat to this symbolic city called for a fanatical response, and Hitler was ready to commit all available forces to its defense. During the Second World War, the Information War was fought just as fiercely for territory and resources. Agencies on both sides sought to crack codes, sabotage operations, and spread misinformation at every opportunity. But thanks to the sponsor of today's video, NordVPN, internet users can be protected from security threats, malware, and phishing attempts using military-grade encryption technology that the Allied and Axis powers could only dream of. NordVPN allows you to change your virtual location with the click of a button to bypass region locking and content restrictions, letting you view documentaries and historical material anywhere at any time. For no additional cost, Threat Protection offers an additional layer of security for your web browsing by blocking malicious files, websites, malware, and trackers, even when you're not connected to a VPN server. Support our channel and get an exclusive discount plus free anti-malware by signing up to NordVPN today using the link in the description, or by visiting NordVPN. Unfortunately for Adolf Hitler, the Nazi governors of Aachen had taken one look at the onrushing Allied armies and promptly abandoned the civilian population to its fate. By the time General Gerhard von Schwerin dragged the shattered remnants of his 116th Panzer Division through the city, he found it full of thousands of terrified civilians and a ragtag collection. Defense of the sector now fell on the shoulders of Lieutenant General Friedrich J. Kochling's 81st Corps, consisting mainly of 2 Volksgrenadier and 2 infantry divisions. While the Germans scrambled to put together a viable strategy, the 3 Army Corps of the American First Army under General Courtney H. Hodges crept closer and closer. Surprisingly enough, the initial skirmishes that took place as the First Army moved to breach the West Wall around Aachen in early September proceeded with minimal casualty. While 3 infantry regiments pushed through the forest to the west side of the city, 2 armored regiments began a flanking attack towards the town of Stolberg. Hundreds of pillboxes and dozens of bunkers with overlapping fields of fire, overlooking extensive minefields and concrete anti-tank obstacles. Though few in number, the professional soldiers of the 12th had been supplemented by a swarm of Volkssturm militia, and traumatized Americans later recalled the sight of women and children fighting with pistols, knives, and even Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. The exact number of German soldiers committed to the battle is impossible to determine, but by the 2nd of October, around 24,000 raw recruits, traumatized veterans, SS fanatics, and terrified Volkssturm stood ready to give their lives to defend the capital of the actual Thousand-Year Reich. Together, they huddled in their bunkers and pillboxes as the Allies saturated the region with artillery fire and bombing raids between September 27th and October 2nd. By the end of just the first day of fighting, the leading American 117th Infantry Battalion had lost 146 men, men. Another battalion had 58 wounded and 12 dead. Over 50 pillboxes had been destroyed or captured, but hundreds still lay between the First Army and victory in the sector. All the while, German reinforcements raced into the sector, including the elite 1st SS Panzer Division. By the 7th of October, the Allies had successfully secured the area around Übach-Palenberg and pushed southwards as far as Alsdorf, but had yet to enter Aachen itself, which was now home to about 5,000 enemy troops. In an effort to avert a bloodbath, Lieutenant General Clarence R. Hübner of the 1st Infantry Division sent an ultimatum to the commander of German forces in Aachen, Colonel Gerhard Wilk, on October 10th. By the 12th, the 2nd and 3rd Battalions had managed to clear out the industrial district and were ready to enter the narrow, twisted maze of streets that made up the inner city. Knowing that massing his troops would lead to a slaughter, Colonel Daniel split up his men into assault platoons, assigning a single M4 Sherman or self-propelled gun to each unit. Despite letting their artillery rain fire over 10,000 shells prior to the main assault, the first American soldiers to set foot in Aachen were still greeted with a hail of machine gun fire, forcing them to scramble for cover in the imposing stone buildings that lined the narrow streets. As they crawled closer to their objectives, 2nd Battalion was confronted by increasingly tough fortifications, including hardened air raid shelters. By the end of the 13th, 3rd Battalion had managed to reach the base of one of these 3 hills they had been assigned to capture, prompting Colonel Wilk to request reinforcements from the German divisions still counterattacking to the east. Thanks to the dense urban terrain, several hundred troops and at least a half-dozen assault guns slipped through the tenuous Allied line the next day. They were just in time to engage Colonel Corley's men as they attacked Wilk's headquarters at Farwick Park, where an intense battle raged until the early evening. But as Corley prepared to renew his advance, he was countermanded by Colonel Hübner. The forces outside Aachen had launched another attack, tying up all available reserves. For over 24 hours, General Koechling's 81st Corps battered the beleaguered 1st Division until both sides were utterly exhausted. But aided by artillery and air support, the Americans were able to dig in and weather the assault, then strike back at the collapsing German line with a decisive blow. Finally, the jaws of the Allied pincer movement were able to slam shut, completely encircling Aachen and leaving Colonel Wilk isolated from further reinforcements. Their eastern flank now secure, the 1st Army was able to take its time mopping up the remaining Germans in Aachen. On the 18th, 2nd Battalion resumed its attack on Farwick Park, driving the defenders into the basement with an artillery barrage before sending assault squads in to secure the Quellenhof Hotel. Though Colonel Wilk had already left the hotel, the defenders put up a tremendous fight, hurling grenades from every entrance and forcing GIs back. In the end, Colonel Corley had to threaten to demolish the entire structure before the Germans finally agreed to surrender. And not even a written order from Colonel Wilk encouraging his troops to fight to the last man inspired much determination. With huge swaths of the city now under American control, the survivors of the 246th Volksgrenadiers were hemmed in on their remaining hilltops, with Observatory Hill falling to the 2nd Battalion on the 19th. By now, Aachen was little more than a mound of rubble, as the Americans systematically demolished any building that could even potentially harbor enemy combatants. With essentially no ground left to go, Colonel Wilk was finally cornered in an air raid shelter on the 20th. As Corley wheeled his favorite 155mm gun into position outside the fortress, Wilk realized the game was up and dispatched several American POWs to carry a message of surrender to the besiegers. The Battle of Aachen represented one of the worst periods of urban fighting in American history, with the First Army sustaining as many as 8,000 casualties during its breach of the West Wall and battle for the city, compared to the 2,400 suffered during the landing on Omaha Beach, popularly considered the bloodiest fight for the US in Europe. German losses amounted to roughly 6,000 dead and over 5,000 prisoners taken. In trying to defend a precious symbol of Nazi ideology, Adolf Hitler had squandered thousands of lives and caused the utter destruction of Charlemagne's ancient capital. This gigantic forest would prove every bit the defenders' paradise, as had Aachen's narrow streets and stone architecture. stalling the First Army until February of 1940. Historians now remember the Battle of Aachen as just one more example of how Germany's stubborn refusal to surrender resulted in a pointless waste of life and the destruction of a beautiful city that had stood intact for well over 1,000 years.